The pre-dawn air in Fed Pass, Tunisia, was not the biting frost of a European winter, but a damp, penetrating cold that clung to the men and the dust alike. It was December 7th, 1942, and the pass itself was a choke point, a narrow corridor of jagged slopes rising steeply on either side, forcing all traffic, all violence, into a single, predictable lane. Crouched in a shallow observation hole, Private First Class Sam Garrett, a ranch kid from western South Dakota, felt the familiar thudding of artillery impacts echoing miles away, a violent tremor passing through the hard earth beneath his boots. His own position, however, was silent, invisible, and to anyone else, utterly useless. For 9 days, this patch of ground had been the center of the battalion's contempt. Garrett's Gopher Mound, they called it. The jokes had been relentless, led by the heavy contempt of First Sergeant Raymond Kowalski and the cool, professional annoyance of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Peton. "Garrett, I've seen dumb ideas. This wouldn't stop a Volkswagen, let alone a Panzer." Peton's threat had been colder. "Your stupid farmer tricks are going to get people killed." Now, the German armor was coming. Intelligence had confirmed 5 Panzer IV Osef G tanks, the backbone of the German offensive, powerful, reliable machines weighing roughly 25 tons, built for speed and fire. They were unstoppable by anything short of a direct hit from a dedicated anti-tank gun or a concentrated heavy minefield. The irony was a raw taste in Garrett's mouth. The enemy's arrogance mirrored his own battalion's ridicule. The German commanders, viewing the pass through narrow vision slits, would see no mines, no gun emplacements, no sandbags, no trenches. They would see a perfectly clear, undisturbed strip of ground, the easiest, safest route to advance. Their doctrine taught them that the absence of visible defense meant safety. They were trained to respect obstacles, not to question opportunity. And this patch of ground, disguised by Garrett's patient, meticulous craft, looked like opportunity itself. Garrett's mind, honed not by military manuals, but by years of trapping coyotes and redirecting cattle, processed the problem with cold, rural logic. The Panzer was not a machine of war. It was a heavy, predictable animal. It followed the path of least resistance. It avoided anything that threatened its tracks, the single most vulnerable point in its movement. This was the foundation of his system. It wasn't about blocking the tank. It was about steering the tank, using its own driver's instinct against it. A good trap doesn't look dangerous. It looks ordinary. He heard the rumble first, a deep, rhythmic growl that carried through the bedrock. Tank engines. Multiple. Close. He pressed himself against the dirt, the vibration growing steadily, a profound bass note of impending destruction. Through the narrow slit of his observation hole, he saw the column materialize out of the faint pre-dawn mist. 5 Panzer IVs, moving slowly, cautiously, their commanders scanning the ridge for the expected American ambush. The lead tank, a dark, heavy shape, began its final approach. It was 40 yards away. 30 yards. 25 yards. The first of Garrett's defenses came into play. 3 uneven mounds of dirt and scrap metal arranged in a subtle curve across the pass floor. To a trained engineer, they were negligible. To the German driver, glimpsing the path through a narrow slit, they were an instinctive steering hazard. The driver made the unconscious decision Garrett had calculated days earlier, a slight, almost imperceptible correction to the left, angling the 25-ton mass toward the smoother-looking ground. The move was flawless. The driver guided the Panzer perfectly onto the patch of camouflage, the covered pit. Garrett's heart seized. This was the moment. The fate of the battalion, and his own court-martial papers, hinged on a wooden lattice he had measured and built by hand. The heavy front tracks of the Panzer IV rolled onto the canvas-covered planks. For 2 eternal seconds, the enormous weight bore down. A soft, muffled crack, the wood straining, was swallowed by the tank's engine noise. Then a sharp, profound crack. Not the roar of an artillery shell, but the subtle, fatal sound of structural collapse. The front tracks punched through the canvas, and the Panzer's nose plunged instantly into the 9-foot-deep excavation. The tank tilted violently forward, snapping the 25-ton body to a sickening 42-degree angle. The rear tracks lifted uselessly into the air, spinning dirt. Inside the cockpit, chaos erupted. The driver thrown forward, the commander losing his balance, the heavy transmission wrenching under the vertical stress. But the true weapon was not the drop. It was the exposure. At that angle, the Panzer's belly armor, the weakest point, just 8 millimeters of thin, soft steel, was fully exposed, suspended directly over Garrett's charges. Garrett had planned for this vulnerability. The moment the hull committed to the drop, 2 contact triggers snapped. Instantly, all 4 of his improvised shaped charges fired upward from the base of the pit. The blast was not a wide, conventional explosion, but a focused, hellish expulsion of molten copper traveling at nearly 7,000 meters per second. 4 hypervelocity jets punched into the soft underbelly. 1 jet tore through the transmission. Another ripped into the commander's station. The third, most critically, struck the low-slung ammunition rack. In a fraction of a second, the stored 75mm rounds ignited. The catastrophic internal explosion tore upward through the turret, blasting the heavy armored piece off the hull entirely. The turret, a monument to German industrial strength, spun high into the darkness before landing with a colossal, grinding clang 30 yards away. Fire erupted from every seam and hatch, turning the 25-ton machine into a blazing inferno of broken steel and detonating ammunition. The entire sequence, from the first snap of the wood to the turret blast, had lasted exactly 11 seconds. To the remaining 4 Panzers, the destruction was inexplicable. Their lead machine had simply vanished into a terrifying, flaming crater created by the ground itself. There was no visible mine, no artillery impact, no enemy flash. Just silence, fire, and the realization that the safest route was, in fact, the most lethal trap. The entire German armored assault had unraveled, stopped cold, by the logic of a South Dakota farm boy. For 9 days, Private First Class Sam Garrett had operated in a vacuum of ridicule. The entire battalion, from the rawest recruit to Lieutenant Colonel Peton, saw only a waste of time and materials. Their contempt was not personal. It was institutional. It was the absolute faith of military doctrine, rigid, precise, and incapable of seeing beyond its own established categories. Their textbook approach to anti-tank defense was defined by brute confrontation. You built sandbags and gun pits. You laid symmetrical fields of anti-tank mines. You deployed M3 anti-tank guns, each a $2,000 piece of specialized hardware designed to pierce 18 millimeters of frontal armor. They expected resistance to look like resistance, heavy, fortified, and obvious. Garrett's construction, scraps of wood, captured explosives, and carefully arranged dirt, was worse than useless. It was an embarrassment. It defied the fundamental principle that to stop a 25-ton Panzer IV, you needed equal or superior force. The American military doctrine saw the Panzer as a cold, efficient, metal adversary that must be met head-on. But Garrett, the ranch kid from South Dakota, saw the Panzer differently. He saw it not as a complex machine of war, but as a heavy, predictable animal. His entire worldview was built on the logic of the hunt. You do not outmuscle a predator. You outthink its behavior. You use its own ingrained habits, its instinct for survival and efficiency, against it. He knew that prairie dogs, coyotes, and now German Panzer drivers all followed the path of least resistance. Tanks avoid rocks, uneven slopes, and anything that might throw a track, because throwing a track in combat is a death sentence. Commanders scanning the battlefield through periscopes, narrow tunnel vision apertures, would instinctively choose the smoothest, safest-looking line of travel. This psychological vulnerability was the true target of Garrett's trap. His system was not an obstacle. It was a behavioral mechanism. The 3 dirt mounds that drew so much scorn were not roadblocks. They were steering wheels. Arranged in a subtle, asymmetrical curve, they gently nudged the 25-ton vehicle's path. A slight course correction to avoid the perceived rough ground of the mounds was a natural, instinctive decision for a driver. This decision, however, aligned the Panzer perfectly with the only visually clear path, the disguised pit. Garrett was guiding the tank, the same way a fence line gently nudges cattle toward the corral entrance. He forced the tank to walk itself into the perfect kill zone. This behavioral channeling was the genius everyone missed. They expected a push. He used a suggestion. They expected confrontation. He used instinct. The difference between military doctrine and Garrett's hunter's logic was the difference between a direct command and a flawless prediction. The structural weakness of the tank was Garrett's second principle, the soft underbelly. The frontal armor of a Panzer IV could withstand a lot of punishment, but the belly armor, the thin, soft steel protecting the engine, transmission, and most critically, the ammunition racks, was often only 8 to 10 millimeters thick. It was the tank's Achilles heel, protected only by the ground beneath it. The core function of Garrett's pit was to use gravity to surgically expose this vulnerability. His careful load-bearing math determined that the wooden lattice roof, covered in canvas and 6 inches of soil, would hold the weight of men and jeeps, but collapse instantly under the ground pressure exerted by the Panzer IV's track area, approximately 6 kilograms per square centimeter. The result was not a crater, but a vertical plunge. When the Panzer's nose dropped 42 degrees into the 9-foot hole, the flimsy belly armor was lifted up and exposed at the perfect 60-degree angle. The thickness of the armor no longer mattered. The kinetic energy of the 25-ton mass became the tank's own undoing, tilting its softest part toward the waiting charges. The ultimate expression of this behavioral physics was the shaped charge itself. Garrett wasn't interested in the brute force destruction of high explosives. He needed surgical precision. A shaped charge, built from repurposed German explosives and copper cones painstakingly hand-formed, uses the immense pressure of the explosion to focus the energy into a narrow jet of superheated, hyper-velocity molten copper. The penetration power of this jet is defined by distance and angle, the exact parameters Garrett had spent days measuring. When the 4 charges fired simultaneously, the jet would strike the thin 8mm belly plate at the calculated standoff distance. It would not explode the tank. It would erase the interior. Molten copper and metal spall would flood the confined crew space, incinerating the transmission and detonating the main ammunition store. This cheap, improvised weapon, costing less than $50 in salvaged materials, could achieve a catastrophic internal kill that heavy anti-tank artillery sometimes failed to deliver with high explosive rounds. Garrett had not built a counterweapon. He had built a behavioral trap. He took the Panzer's predictable need for smooth ground, used the deceptive appearance of his mounds to channel that behavior, and exploited the immutable law of gravity to reveal its single, fatal weakness to an improvised, yet perfectly optimized, shaped charge attack. This was the genius everyone missed. They expected a push. He used a suggestion. They expected confrontation. He used instinct. The difference between military doctrine and Garrett's hunter's logic was the difference between a direct command and a flawless prediction. When the Panzer's nose punched through the false ground, time seemed to distort. To the German crew inside, the drop probably felt like a nightmare. Sudden, violent, impossible to understand. To Garrett, watching from his foxhole, it looked exactly like the diagrams in his notebook. The drop. The moment the lattice collapsed, the front of the tank plunged straight down into the 9-foot pit. The hull snapped into a 42-degree nose-down angle, the exact range Garrett had calculated. The tank's rear lifted off the ground. Its tracks spun uselessly in the air, kicking dirt. The heavy hull slammed against the sides of the pit, locking it into place. Inside, the driver was thrown forward against his controls. The commander in the cupola was jerked downward violently, losing his balance. A Panzer IV was not designed for this posture. Nothing about its structure or weight distribution was built for a vertical drop. But Garrett had planned for this moment. Gravity was now the real weapon. The first detonation, as the tank's belly slammed into the bottom, 2 metal triggers beneath the camouflage snapped under the impact. Instantly, all 4 shaped charges fired upward from the base of the pit. A shaped charge is not a simple explosion. It is a weapon that turns copper into a molten needle-thin jet at 7,000 meters per second, nearly 7 times the speed of a rifle bullet. 4 jets punched upward. The first tore through the driver's position, killing him instantly and obliterating the transmission. The second cut upward beneath the commander's station, ripping through the turret basket. The third struck the ammunition rack stored low inside the hull. That one mattered most. Ammunition cook off. Inside the tank, it took less than a second for the heat and shock to ignite the stored rounds. A Panzer IV carried 72 rounds of 75mm ammunition and 3,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition. When those rounds cook off inside a confined metal box, the result is catastrophic. The explosion tore upward through the turret, blasting it off the hull entirely. The turret spun as it flew, landing more than 30 meters away, throwing flames and fragments across the pass. The hull bulged outward, armor seams peeling back like torn metal petals. Fire erupted through every hatch, seam, and opening. The blast lit the entire pass with a pulse of orange light. For the German crew, death was instantaneous. Backup charges detonate. 5 seconds after the shaped charges fired, the perimeter charges triggered automatically. 6 separate blasts erupted around the pit, designed to kill any surviving crew attempting to escape. But there were no survivors. Instead, the secondary explosions widened the pit, shattered the remains of the hull, and blew additional debris across the pass. What had been a 25-ton armored vehicle earlier was now an inferno of broken steel and burning fuel, silence, and shock. The entire sequence lasted 11 seconds. Garrett watched flames climb into the early morning darkness. Everything he calculated, angles, weight distribution, explosive timing, damage radius, had worked perfectly. But the moment of celebration wasn't his because the second tank in the German column was still there. The second Panzer stops in panic 50 meters behind the first tank. The commander had seen the lead vehicle behave normally and then vanish into an explosion he couldn't comprehend. To his eyes, there was no visible mine, no crater, no obvious source of the blast, no shell impact, no smoke trail, no muzzle flash. It looked like the ground itself had killed the tank. That made it worse than a minefield. It made it unknown. The three trailing tanks stopped as well, forming a stalled column. According to standard German armored doctrine, the second tank should investigate. But how do you investigate something you can't see? The covered pit, now exposed by the explosion, still looked like normal terrain, except where the tank had torn through it. There were no wires, no charges, no clues, only a flaming crater and a missing turret. From the German perspective, the Americans had deployed a type of weapon they had never encountered. The Germans attempt a bypass. At this moment, the 2nd Panzer's commander made a decision. He tried to bypass the destroyed tank by steering left toward the slope, but Garrett had predicted this exact reaction. The dirt mounds weren't just designed to funnel the first tank. They were positioned to channel any bypass attempt toward the second covered pit he had secretly excavated. The moment the second tank committed to the alternate route, its tracks rolled toward that second disguised patch of ground. The second pit collapsed. The 2nd Panzer dropped.
The second set of charges fired, and the pass filled with another fireball. 2 Panzers destroyed. 19 seconds total. The remaining 3 tanks reversed immediately, desperate to escape what they believed was an invisible anti-tank minefield. The moment the 2nd Panzer vanished into a blast of fire and shrapnel, the entire German attack unraveled. The remaining 3 tanks didn't wait for instructions. They didn't push forward. They didn't look for an alternate path. They simply reversed hard. German doctrine emphasized aggression, but it also demanded caution when the lead tank was destroyed by an unknown threat. And this wasn't just unknown, it was invisible. To the German crews, it looked as if American forces had deployed a minefield that left no crater, explosives that detonated upward, and a system that destroyed tanks instantly and without warning. No training manual had ever warned them about a weapon like this. A wall of burning steel.
By the time the 3rd and 4th tanks backed away, the entire pass was clogged with smoke and flame. 2 Panzers burned fiercely, their ammunition still popping from the heat. Armor plates glowed red. The smell of fuel and burning rubber filled the air. The exploding turrets and rising flames turned the narrow mountain corridor into a furnace. At 200 yards away, First Sergeant Kowalski slowly stood up in his foxhole, staring in disbelief. This was the same man who had spent 9 days calling Garrett's idea the dumbest thing he'd seen in 14 years of service. Now he was watching 2 German tanks destroyed faster than any anti-tank gun he'd ever operated. Murphy and Shaw, the loudest voices mocking Garrett, looked equally stunned. No one spoke. The pass was sealed. The German attack had stopped cold. And nothing, no artillery, no infantry push, no armor breakthrough could pass that burning wreckage now.
Garrett, how many tanks? Kowalski eventually forced himself to walk toward Garrett's position. He climbed up the slope, boots crunching on gravel, eyes fixed on the destruction. Garrett was exactly where he'd been the entire time, lying still, observing, taking notes in his small notebook, as if this were just another calculation to verify. The sergeant stood beside him, throat dry. Garrett, how many tanks? Garrett didn't lift his eyes. 2, Sergeant, both destroyed in primary trap sequences. Kowalski stared at the burning pass again. He whispered at first, almost to himself, "Your stupid farmer tricks just destroyed 2 Panzers." Garrett nodded quietly. "Yes, Sergeant. They functioned exactly as calculated." Kowalski blinked, stunned. "I called your trap the dumbest idea I'd ever seen." Garrett didn't respond. Kowalski finally exhaled. "I was wrong. That wasn't dumb. That was the most effective anti-tank system I've ever seen. Word spreads through the battalion. By first light, half the battalion had gathered near the pass. Officers, NCOs, engineers, even cooks who had heard the explosions. They stood on the ridge, pointing, whispering, trying to understand how one private with dirt, wood, and captured explosives had done what textbooks said required mines, anti-tank guns, or entire artillery batteries. Lieutenant Colonel Peton arrived next. He walked toward the smoking ruins, boots sinking into blackened mud, eyes scanning the destroyed tanks. He moved in silence for several minutes, inspecting the collapsed pit, the exposed charge positions, the blasted perimeter wires. It was exactly as Garrett had described. Every detail matched the private's explanation. Finally, Peton spoke. Not loudly, not angrily, just a quiet acknowledgement. Private Garrett has demonstrated exceptional understanding of physics, engineering, and enemy tactics. He wrote the rest in his after-action report later that morning. His improvised anti-tank trap system achieved complete destruction of 2 enemy tanks using materials costing less than $50. Recommend immediate promotion and assignment to engineering section. And the Germans on the German side, panic ran far deeper. Recon reports captured months later described Fed Pass as Americans' fortgeschrittenes unsichtbares Panzerabwehrsystem, American Advanced Invisible Anti-Tank Minefield System. To them, this wasn't improvisation. It was a new American weapon, one they couldn't detect, couldn't understand, and couldn't bypass. It wasn't true, but it didn't matter. Fear changes doctrine faster than facts. And that fear had just begun. Morning light finally pushed through the smoke hanging over Fed Pass. 2 Panzer IVs still burned, their twisted armor glowing in the weak sun. Flames licked out of shattered seams. Ammunition inside occasionally snapped and cracked like distant popcorn.
The pass was completely blocked, a wall of burning steel and broken machinery. No German force would be pushing through today or tomorrow or any day soon. But the greater shock wasn't on the German side. It was inside the American lines. The battalion wakes up to a new truth. By sunrise, officers from other companies were making their way up to the ridge for a closer look. They walked in small groups, pointing at the collapsed pits, the torn-up earth, the blasted charges. None of it resembled any anti-tank defense they'd been trained to recognize. Some crouched down to touch the soil. Some stared at the melted copper remnants of shaped charges. Some simply whispered to themselves, unable to make sense of the destruction. "Who built this?" one lieutenant asked. "Just one guy," someone replied. "Garrett the farm kid?" The lieutenant blinked. That can't be right. But it was. Word spread rapidly. 1 private, dirt, scrap wood, captured explosives, 2 dead tanks, 0 shots fired.
The story seemed absurd, but the evidence was right there, burning in front of them. The colonel's inspection. Lieutenant Colonel Peton approached the site with a different expression from the rest. No disbelief, no confusion. He had heard Garrett's explanation in detail. He knew what he was looking for. He crouched near the collapsed pit, examining the remaining wooden lattice, the angles of the debris, the scorch marks from the shaped charges. He traced the wiring with his gloved fingers, checking how Garrett had routed each connection. Every detail matched exactly what Garrett had described 2 days earlier. He straightened up, scanning the pass one more time. Garrett stood nearby, waiting silently. The colonel didn't speak immediately. He simply looked at the destruction, then back at the private who refused to dismantle his creation. Finally, "Private Garrett." Garrett braced for the worst. The colonel continued, "I underestimated you."
It was the closest thing to an apology an officer of his rank would ever give. Later that morning, Peton wrote the after-action report that would become famous. Private Garrett has demonstrated exceptional understanding of physics, engineering, and enemy tactics. His improvised anti-tank trap system achieved complete destruction of 2 enemy tanks using materials costing less than $50. And at the bottom, recommend immediate promotion. Recommend assignment to Battalion Engineering Section. It wasn't just praise. It was recognition that Garrett's stupid farm trick had proven more effective than standard anti-tank doctrine. The sergeant's reckoning. First Sergeant Kowalski returned to Garrett's position later that morning. His face held none of the smug confidence from earlier days. He stopped beside Garrett, staring at the burning wreckage. "Garrett," he muttered almost reluctantly, "back there. I called your idea the dumbest thing I'd ever seen." Garrett didn't reply.
Kowalski shook his head slowly. Turns out I was the dumb one. That wasn't a joke. That was the best damn anti-tank system I've ever witnessed. It wasn't a speech, wasn't flowery, just an honest admission from a man who had seen enough battles to know what real effectiveness looked like. And for Garrett, that meant more than the promotion. The German interpretation, far away on the German side, the reaction was completely different. After-action notes, captured months later, described FedPass as Americans' fortgeschrittenes, unsichtbares Panzerabwehrsystem. American Invisible Anti-Tank Defense System. They believed the Americans had developed a brand new, undetectable anti-tank minefield. They believed it used multiple charges, redundant fuses, and upward blasts specifically designed for belly armor. They had no idea it was the work of one private with ranch instincts. Fear filled the rest of their report.
Standard reconnaissance procedures and armored attacks through confined terrain no longer reliable. Garrett had not only killed 2 tanks, he had changed enemy behavior, and he had done it using principles no manual had ever taught. FedPass stayed silent for the rest of the day. No more German armor pushed forward. No reconnaissance patrol approached the wreckage, and no soldier, American or German, doubted the outcome anymore. But Lieutenant Colonel Peton wasn't interested in celebrating. He was thinking ahead. If one improvised trap could do this, what could several do? A new mission. On December 9th, supply trucks arrived carrying engineering materials, lumber, canvas, wire, and captured explosives. Instead of handing them to the battalion's official engineers, Peton walked straight to Garrett, Private, actually, Corporal Garrett. Garrett looked up, surprised. "You're being promoted, and you're being reassigned. Your job now is to build more traps, as many as possible."
How many can you make with what you see here? Garrett studied the supplies for a moment. 3 full systems, sir, each taking around 8 to 10 days to build. Peton nodded. Good. You have 3 weeks. Build them and train men so they can build more when you're not there. Garrett saluted. This time nobody laughed. The team of 4. The colonel assigned him 4 assistants. Ironically, they were the same men who mocked him the most. Corporal Murphy, who had named it the Gopher Mound, Private Shaw, and 2 others who spent 9 days joking about his dirt. But something inside them shifted after witnessing 2 Panzers obliterated by a farm boy's design. Murphy was the first to speak up. "Sir, I want to learn how he builds these traps. I was wrong. I want to understand it." Garrett didn't hold grudges. He just nodded and began teaching. To their surprise, there was no magic, just logic, behavioral channeling, soil matching, structural collapse timing, explosion geometry.
The same men who mocked him now listened with absolute focus. Murphy turned out to be excellent at camouflage, better than Garrett expected. He matched rock patterns, dirt coloration, and shadow angles with near-perfect accuracy. Garrett taught them the principle. If the ground looks even 1% wrong, a tanker will notice it. Your job is to make the wrong ground look perfectly right. The second trap system, North Route. The second system was built on a northern approach route. Intelligence suggested the Germans might attempt a flanking maneuver there. Garrett designed this trap with 2 pits in sequence. The first to catch the lead tank, the second to catch the inevitable bypass attempt. He calculated the distance between them based on Panzer turning radius, evading behavior, average corrective path. It was FedPass all over again, but with improvements. On January 3rd, 3 German tanks, advanced along that northern route. The first hit the primary pit and was destroyed instantly. The second tried to bypass, turned exactly where Garrett predicted, and fell into the second pit. The third reversed into debris from the first explosion and immobilized itself. 3 tanks neutralized. 0 American casualties. The third trap system, Western approach. The third system was even more advanced. Garrett arranged 3 pits in a triangular formation. 1 for the lead tank, 1 for the bypass, 1 for the bypass of the bypass. You could not escape it without leaving the road entirely, and leaving the road meant certain track damage. Every angle, every mound, every camouflage patch was shaped by the lessons from Fed Pass. On January 11th, a German armored reconnaissance patrol stumbled into this third trap. 4 Panzer IVs entered the approach. The first tank triggered the center pit and exploded immediately. The second and third tried to bypass each, triggering one of the flanking pits.
The fourth attempted to reverse quickly and backed into a boulder, tearing its transmission apart. 4 tanks eliminated, 1 boulder assisted, 7 tanks in total destroyed across the second and third systems. German radio total breakdown. Intercepted German communications revealed something extraordinary. Total loss of confidence in attacking through narrow terrain. One message later translated read, American defensive positions in confined terrain employ anti-tank trap systems of unprecedented effectiveness. Standard reconnaissance procedures are inadequate. Losses exceed acceptable limits by factor of 5. Recommend suspension of armored attacks through mountain passes. Garrett hadn't just built traps. He had built fear. And fear was now doing more damage than explosives. When the smoke of Tunisia finally cleared, Garrett's traps were no longer some strange farm experiment. They were a case study. Army engineers, intelligence officers, and even generals began requesting briefings, not to mock him, but to learn exactly how he had done it. The Army Corps of Engineers eventually conducted interviews, diagrams, simulations, and post-action analysis on every trap he built. The findings were blunt. Behavioral prediction was more powerful than brute force. Visual deception mattered more than thick armor. Redundancy mattered more than a single perfect weapon. Psychology could shape an entire battlefield. What Garrett had built for less than $50 accomplished what $2,000 anti-tank guns sometimes couldn't. And that raised an uncomfortable question deep inside Army doctrine. How did one untrained farm kid outperform our entire engineering corps? The engineering report, the formal engineering analysis did not mince words. It listed the reasons for success in technical detail. Behavioral channeling, traps placed where tanks would go, not where engineers wished they might. Visual deception, camouflage design from real soil, real rocks, real sun angles, redundant kill paths, shaped charge plans, wire backups, psychological impact. German armor refused to attack terrain they previously considered safe. Garrett didn't match German strength. He exploited German patterns. He didn't design for what tanks could see. He designed for what tanks couldn't. He didn't try to build bigger weapons. He built smarter traps. For the first time, formal doctrine admitted something radical. Unconventional civilian knowledge could outperform formal training. The manual now only 1 pages of farm logic. The Army eventually produced a 91-page manual titled Improvised Anti-Tank Obstacles and Trap Systems. Most of the core principles came straight from Garrett's field notes written on scraps of notepaper during the long nights before Fed Pass. The manual taught soldiers to read terrain the way hunters read animal trails, predict tank movements based on instinct, not order, build traps from local materials, prioritize invisibility over showmanship. Its most important paragraph came near the end. Effective battlefield engineering requires accepting that innovation does not always come from doctrine. Soldiers with civilian experience may possess specialized insight more valuable than standardized procedures. It was the first time in Army history that institutional doctrine confessed. Sometimes the farm boy knows something the engineers don't. The German perspective. German prisoners later revealed how deeply the traps affected morale. One Panzer commander said, "Mines and guns we understood, but these invisible pits, no training prepared us for that. We feared the ground itself." Another report noted, American positions in confined terrain use anti-tank trap systems of unprecedented effectiveness. Losses exceed acceptable parameters. Recommend avoidance of mountain passes entirely. Garrett hadn't just killed tanks. He had changed German behavior, and fear did the rest. A force that refuses to advance is a force already defeated. The man behind the traps, Garrett served through Sicily, Italy, and France. He rose to staff sergeant, but he never became the kind of soldier who bragged. When the war ended, he returned to South Dakota, ran the family ranch, and kept solving problems the same way he always had, quietly, logically, and with just enough improvisation to surprise everyone. In a 1992 interview, a historian pressed him, "Why didn't anyone else think of these traps?" Garrett answered simply, "Most people saw tanks as things you fight head on. I saw them the way I saw prairie dogs, predictable, habitual, vulnerable. If you knew where they stepped," he paused, then added, "you don't need a big weapon if you understand behavior. That's all it was." They called his idea stupid. They called it a waste of time. They laughed at the dirt piles, the wooden lattice, the ridiculous notion that a farm boy could stop a tank with nothing but physics and instinct. But in 11 seconds, the trap blew a Panzer apart and forced everyone from sergeants to colonels to German armored commanders to rethink what was possible. Garrett didn't win because he was stronger or better equipped or higher ranked. He won because he understood something armies often forget. Innovation doesn't come from manuals. It comes from people who see what others ignore. And if one farm kid could rewrite anti-tank warfare with scraps of wood and captured explosives, imagine what other forgotten stories are still out there. If you want to see another moment where one overlooked soldier changed the entire battlefield, watch the next video on screen. It reveals a tactic even German generals never saw coming. Because history isn't just battles, it's breakthroughs, sometimes created by the most unexpected people.